probably know by now, Karen and I recently returned from our mid-year team meetings with our parent organization, Unity Worldwide Ministries. Karen got to go to sunny and warm Phoenix, where her team was meeting. And I spent a lovely week in Kansas City. Now don't get me wrong, I love Kansas City. You want to talk about great food, if you like barbecue, jazz, got all sorts of things going for it. But it's still January in the Midwest, which is now a bit of a jolt after spending 10 years out here in California. You go back there and, you know, there's no grass, it's just gray mush. Everything is sort of a different shade of gray. And it can be kind of challenging when I'm on some of our monthly conference calls with ministers who are all around the country. And of course, you know, the talk always turns to the weather, right? And so they're talking about the weather in the Midwest or in the East, the most recent snowpocalypse or snowmageddon or whatever they're calling it, ice storm, sub-zero wind chills and things like this. And then, of course, just to be polite, they ask, well, how are things out this way? And it's a challenge to answer honestly without sounding like I'm gloating. I end up saying something like, oh, you know, not so great. It rained over the weekend. We got gray skies today. There was fog yesterday morning. You just don't tell them that for the other 5 days it was 75 and sunny in January or whatever it happens to be. The great thing about that is that there's always something that I can focus on to appreciate and be grateful for. From that perspective, I can say that life is good, and not just because of the weather, one of the things, but for countless other reasons. And that's really one of the core values that we teach in Unity, which is the importance of focusing on the true, the good, the beautiful. It's around us all the time, whether we notice it or not. It's just a matter of paying attention. It's important to take a little time to reflect on where we want to direct our gratitude and our appreciation, something we might want to focus and reflect on. And something that I've found myself reflecting on over the past few weeks here is something that's called the Season for Nonviolence, for reasons which I'll get to here in a few moments. Some of you might be familiar with the Season for Nonviolence. It started a couple of weeks ago at the end of January, and in the grand scheme of things, this Season for Nonviolence hasn't been with us for all that long. It started just back in 1998. It was a collaboration between the Association for Global New Thought, of which Unity is a part, and Arun Gandhi, who is Mahatma Gandhi's grandson. What they were doing was looking for some way to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Gandhi's death. And the result was this 64-day celebration of the principles of peace and nonviolence, which were really Gandhi's core teachings. The season starts out at the end of January, January 30th, which is the date of Gandhi's death. And then it ends on April 4th, which is the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think it's pretty obvious how those two people are connected, because Dr. King consciously modeled the example and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi while he was leading the civil rights movement in our country. And we've come to know, in really a more direct and local and personal way, we've come to know the power of peaceful protest, nonviolence, and civil disobedience through the actions of Martin Luther King and his followers during the 60s. King and Gandhi, they're great examples of something we were talking about last week. We were talking about conscious evolution. They were conscious evolutionaries. They had mastered the art of making friends with paradox, which we mentioned was one of the practices that supports conscious evolution. The paradox they made friends with, the paradox that they encountered, was this radical idea that nonviolence can be more powerful than violence in bringing about revolutionary change in the world. And make no mistake about it, what Gandhi and King accomplished was revolutionary. In this country, back in the late 50s and even into the mid-60s, there were these powerful, entrenched political and cultural forces that were determined to hang on to segregation at all costs. In India, Great Britain was clinging to the last pieces of its once huge and mighty colonial empire, and conventional wisdom said that it would take an army and weapons to accomplish anything that was meaningful or permanent. And that's the thing about conventional wisdom. It's often wrong, not always, but conventional wisdom has a hard time dealing with paradox. Gandhi and King saw another possibility. I've noticed that in pop culture America, nonviolence is often regarded as something weak, passive. The word wimp comes to mind. And nothing could be farther from the truth. There was nothing passive or wimpy about the way that Dr. King and Gandhi went about dealing with and confronting injustice. They believed in remaining peaceful during a confrontation, and both they and their followers were willing to die for what they believed, and many did. I'll never forget that scene from the movie Gandhi. His followers are lined up outside this factory that was closed. They wanted jobs. And one by one, they walked up to the gates of this factory where British soldiers were waiting, and one by one, they were clubbed into submission, voluntarily confronting that kind of injustice. And then there's the famous scene from the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, 1965. Unarmed protesters being beaten, gassed, chewed up by police dogs. And on just a slightly different note, how about this picture of that anonymous Chinese student down there standing in front of the tanks? He's known only as Tank Man. Tiananmen Square, 1989. The massacre started not too long after this picture was taken, and still today nobody knows who this guy was or what became of him. So, wimpy, weak, passive. Those aren't the words that come to mind when I see things like this, when I think of things like that. Practicing nonviolence requires the courage of a warrior. And this is a warrior whose only weapons consist of unflinching desire to see justice and freedom prevail. And when I see these examples, I think to myself, would I have what it takes to do what they did? Would I have what it takes? The great irony in all of this is that these great champions of nonviolence were ultimately victims of violence. Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu extremist who was enraged over the very idea that Gandhi was tolerant toward Muslims in India. Dr. King was killed by a white racist who refused to accept the idea that people with darker skin than him were entitled to the same rights that he was. And both Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi were influenced by the life and teachings of Jesus, who was another proponent of nonviolence, and of course we know the same thing happened to him. He inspired a movement, and then he was taken out by violence. So all of this leads to yet another question. Here in the midst of the season for nonviolence, are nonviolent and peaceful protests still relevant in a world where terrorism is very real? And that's one of the reasons why this is kind of up for me, because here we are in the midst of the season for nonviolence, and we're witnessing a spike in violent actions around the world. What legacy and message are we leaving for the new generation, for the next generation with this season for nonviolence? in the face of what we're looking at right now? How is this season for nonviolence going to equip the next generation to deal with these kinds of real-world problems? We have all these different groups perpetrating violence who claim to be practicing an ideologically and historical pure version of a religion, Islam. You can't get away from it every time you turn on the TV or pick up a newspaper or look at the news. And I find it interesting that I've heard almost no talk about these atrocities in unity circles. And it concerns me a bit because I wonder if our emphasis on positive thinking might be keeping us uninformed, naive. I hope not. I know we all want to be positive, but that doesn't mean oblivious. Reality has multiple dimensions, and this is a universe where we have many, many wise teachers who show us how to embody compassion and live in peace. And it's also a universe with people who think it's a wonderful thing to kill other people in the name of their religious beliefs. So the question then is, how does wisdom respond to that kind of violent consciousness? And first and foremost, I want to say that nonviolence doesn't mean that we are required to allow ourselves and others to be harmed. Nonviolence is not pacifism. And I hope that we're not sending the message that force is never justified, necessary, or ethical. Self-defense of self, defense of others, is an ethical choice. And whatever we do, it has to be appropriate and reasonable. And that's always the problem. Figuring out what is appropriate and reasonable. And I think this is where our focus on nonviolence is going to be so helpful going forward. To me, nonviolence means that we refuse to see violence as the first, best, and always appropriate response to a threat. It's difficult to do that in our culture. It's difficult to do because of the way we see violence characterized constantly. We have this either-or tendency in our culture to either trivialize violence on one extreme or glorify it over here on the other extreme. Now, for those of you who are a fan of old movies and TV shows, particularly of the Western genre, doesn't there seem to be this unwritten rule that most Westerns at some point have to feature a barroom brawl? A fight of some kind. Fists flying, guys breaking chairs and bottles over each other's heads, and then the sheriff comes in and fires a few shots into the ceiling, and everybody gets up and dusts themselves off and goes on their merry way. A few black eyes and a few bloody lips, but everybody's okay, no major damage. I mean, seriously? Really? Or cartoon shows, right, where characters, they get blown up, shot, beat up repeatedly every single episode, and the next time the show is on, they're back for more, right? The message is that violence is kind of fun. No permanent damage, no long-term consequences from that kind of thing. And then there's the other extreme. Movies, TV shows, video games that focus on graphic and gory violence, where the person who kills the most is the winner, is the hero. Violence equals victory, violence equals success, violence equals superiority. So, we glorify it or we trivialize it, and either one of those extremes tends to make it more acceptable and even desirable. That's the challenge. Censorship. Some people offer that as a solution. Censorship is not a solution. Not even self-censorship. I mean, if you don't like those things, by all means, you have every right to not watch them, to not play the games or things like that. But we do have to remember that other people will. Other people who may be impressionable, who may be getting the wrong message from those kinds of things, those games, those movies, those TV shows that glorify or trivialize violence, they're going to watch them. And the most important thing, I think, is to be able to have a conversation about the message that's being sent. What are you learning about violence when you watch this program? Is it being treated as something acceptable? Is it treated as a solution? Is it treated as a scourge? We need to be able to have that kind of conversation. The solution is promoting education and promoting critical thinking skills for ourselves and especially for the next generation. That's the legacy we want to leave. The greatest threat to human freedom and thriving is when we substitute an ideology for reason and critical thinking. I'm going to offer a radical idea for your consideration here during this season for nonviolence. Consider the possibility that Jesus, Gandhi, and Dr. King were not trying to give us a one-size-fits-all solution for every single form of conflict. They weren't trying to impose an ideology. What they demonstrate so well, I believe, is in fact the power of critical thinking. They didn't approach what they were up against with a prefabricated ideology based on nonviolence. They approached the situation pragmatically, rationally, and concluded that nonviolent resistance and disobedience was the solution that was most likely to get them what they wanted under the circumstances that they were facing. They may have embraced nonviolence, but they were still warriors. They knew, they had to know, with a high level of certainty that they faced violence at the hands of police, the National Guard, reactionary mobs, you name it. They were willing to provoke a violent response, but not become violent themselves. They were willing to provoke a violent response and then use that response to place the spotlight of public opinion on the injustice and oppression that they were challenging. And it worked. So here's another question. Does that mean that Jesus, Gandhi, and Dr. King in some way utilized violence to achieve their goals? I'm not going to offer an answer. I submit that question as an invitation for you to apply your own freedom to think for yourselves, using reason as your guide instead of some pre-formed ideology or the proclamations of authority figures. It's the greatest gift that we've been given. The kind of freedom that Jesus, Gandhi, and Dr. King died for was that freedom. And that's the message I want to see reaching the next generation. Jesus, Gandhi, and Dr. King did not die in the name of some kind of abstract ideology or absolute truth. They died for the right to challenge, to question, and to think for themselves. And that is a precious, precious thing, and that's what I want to carry on to the next generation. Hope to see you next week as we start the Easter season. Thank you.